Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on teacher shortages and smart solutions to tackle these teacher shortages, organized by VLEVA and OVSG. Before we start, I will introduce myself and briefly go over the technical and house rules. So my name is Maarten Libeer, liaison officer for education, work and social policy here at VLEVA, and I'm also your moderator for today. So this webinar is organized via GoToWebinar. Participants cannot unmute themselves or show their video, but asking questions is of course possible, but only via the question box in the control panel. If possible, also mention your organization. We will try to answer as much as possible as of the questions that were submitted in advance, and also those questions that are asked live through the question box, and they will all be addressed during the extensive Q&A we have at the end of the info session after all the panelists have gave their presentation, right before the closing statement of Mr. Leroy. Now we start by listening to the opening remarks from Mr. Patriek Delbaere. Mr. Delbaere is the director of OVSG, the education organization for cities and municipalities here in Flanders. OVSG is the third biggest education provider in Flanders and is an important voice in discussions on education and, of course, the discussion on teacher shortages. Mr. Delbaere, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome also. We are delighted to have you here to participate and share in this conference. This conference focuses on two major points. Why are we in a teacher shortage and how can we work this out? Solving the teacher shortage is a pressing issue. It is even the most pressing issue that our education system faces. We need to staff our classrooms with a stable teaching workforce that is both responsive to complex pupil and student needs and able to cope with the growing demands of the knowledge economy. We observe that for some subjects, such as mathematics and technical matters, there are not enough teacher candidates. We observe that the number of entrants to teaching is decreasing. Less people are attracted to become a teacher, as well as high rates of teacher turnover. We fail to attract candidates and we fail to keep qualified teachers in our workforce. However, we need to find an answer because a major wave of retirements due to demographic reasons is on the way. The challenges to this two-sided problem are many, as in how to overcome the shortages and how to reduce the shortage in the shortest time possible. In this conference, we want to explore a few solutions. As we scrutinize the issue for what is driving the problem, our first observation is that we are not alone. The teacher shortage is a worldwide problem. Secondly, in all countries, policymakers try to assess why teacher recruitment and retention is so difficult. Overall research identifies 5 major factors influencing a person's decision to enter the job and to remain or leave once graduated as a teacher. These factors revolve in all countries more or less the same for the following reasons: salaries and other compensations, preparations to the job and costs to entry, hiring and personnel management, induction programs and support for new teachers, working conditions such as including school, leadership, professional collaboration and shared decision-making, accountability systems and resources for teaching and learning. We can further observe that within 5 years, a considerable amount of teachers leave the profession. The backdrop is due to diverse reasons, such as lack of additional support to do the job, an unrealistic idea of what the job contents entails, administrative burden, and etc. The starting teachers are not ready for the classroom due to a difference of the idea of the content of the job and how it is presented during the training and the reality. Asked why people wanted to become a teacher, they often state that they entered the profession to make a difference. We deal with a group of people with similar features. Wanting to make a difference, highly involved, in search of a high job satisfaction, a little bit individualistic, high potential. And the challenge is to attract high potentials and to keep them. How can we deal with this? We see that all countries try similar recipes to address the challenge. Better wage conditions seem to stand out as an important solution, and within this area, the idea of merit pay. The idea seems simple. We pay good teachers better, but of course, reality is much more complex. For it does not work out in a way that teachers will change the way they teach because of higher wages. Also, good teaching is not the sole responsibility of a single teacher. What happens with miscasts in the team cannot only be referred to the teacher, but is a shared responsibility of all members of the staff. Thus, salary rise or merit pay appears to influence teacher attraction, but will not be the decisive factor. Besides salaries, job satisfaction is another key factor to retain teachers. The job satisfaction can be created by adding fringe benefits or assets, going from a warm welcome in a team to coaching, alternative ways of assigning work, setting up a professional environment and providing help to starting teachers. The city of Antwerp starts with such projects. We are happy to learn from their experiences. This leads me to briefly present the program. We will first listen to Mr. Peter Birch. He will present the Eurydice report on teachers in Europe. Then we listen to Mr. Tapio Savaria. He will reveal us the European context and action taken. We will continue with inspiring examples. Mr. Toves is from the city of Antwerp, where the city set up a scale of actions in order to attract and retain teachers. Mr. McCord will explain how in Ireland actions are taken, followed by the Swedish perspective discussed by Mrs. Bodil Bavner. Fons Leroy, former CEO of the Flemish Employment Agency, will conclude. I would like to thank VLEVA and all speakers for their contribution. I also thank you, participants, for following this conference and showing your interest. Small or big steps bring us to solutions, all contributing to alleviate the challenge we want and need to solve, not only urgently, but also in the long run. I thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Mr. Delbaere, for the introduction. And indeed, we also had a brief look at the agenda, and now the first speaker can come on stage, so that's Mr. Peter Birch from Eurydice. So as an introduction, we'll look at the data regarding teacher shortages in it was in the brand new publication from Eurydice on teachers. Eurydice is a network of 39 national units based in all 36 countries of the Erasmus Plus program. And the task of Eurydice is to explain how education systems are organized all over Europe and how they work. In doing that, they publish descriptions of national education systems, comparative reports devoted to specific topics, indicators and statistics, as well as news and articles related to the field of education. The report we are discussing today is called Teachers in Europe, Careers, Development and Well-Being. And there Eurydice combines data on national legislation with data on teachers' practices and perceptions. The main findings are actually divided on 5 distinct points. It's working conditions, teaching careers, teacher appraisal, teachers' well-being, and teacher mobility. And the findings of this report will be presented by Mr. Peter Birch. Mr. Birch is a coordinator for education policy and systems analysis in the Eurydice network at the executive agency of the European Commission. He also has been coordinating this report on the teaching profession in Europe, focusing on initial teacher education, continuing professional development, job satisfaction, and attractiveness and retention. He is currently also engaging in the update of the mobility scoreboard and in the new study on higher education staff. He has a degree in foreign languages and a master's degree in education with the Open University of the UK. He has also been involved in projects dealing with e-learning, language learning, and school quality assurance. He also has experience as a teacher and a trainer, and I think he's perfectly fitted for today's presentation on the report from Eurydice. So, Mr. Birch, the floor is entirely yours.
Thank you, Maarten, for this introduction, and thank you also to you and to Mr. Delbaere for inviting me to this webinar. It's a great occasion for us for me to present the work that we've been carrying out in the last couple of years. First of all, I want to say, I mean, Mr. Delbaere has described the situation very well. I mean, there's not much else to add to the description of the complexity of the problem of teacher shortages. Something that has to do not only with the current with the attractiveness for young people, but also something that has to do with the current state of the profession itself. So what I'm going to try to do is to bring to the table a bit of data before you go into the discussions on the different policies and different experiences that are taking place in order to overcome teacher shortages. And I'm going to do that by giving you a glimpse of the Teachers in Europe report, which is we have just published on the 24th of March. So it's still very not even a month, very recent. A report that doesn't necessarily focus on teacher shortages, but starts from there witnessing the issue of teacher shortages, and then moves on to look at different aspects of the teaching profession, which of course altogether affect what can be maybe called in some countries the vocational crisis of teaching. So the report looks at different aspects, as it was also highlighted by Maarten. We have a first area where we deal with the attractiveness of the teaching profession, where basically we look at some of the working conditions like contractual status, we look at working hours, and I will show some of these this data later on. We look at initial teacher education and induction, then continuing professional development, appraisal, the transnational mobility, which is a very important dimension at European level and also very important in the area of continuing professional development, and then an emerging area, which is teachers' well-being, where there is scope for work and overall can also contribute to making the profession more attractive. The report itself is also complemented by a number of annexes, like, for example, the list and description of mobility programs, transnational mobility programs across European countries, and career structures, CPD agencies, and so on. So there is a wealth of information and qualitative information in the report, and there is also a statistical. There are also statistical tables with all the quantitative data that we have analyzed and that we have put all together in a file in open format, and all this is free for access, of course, on our website, and I'll give you the links later on in my presentation. If we can move slide, please. The report doesn't, the scope of the report deals with specific aspects, of course. We focus on lower secondary education, teachers, so what is called in German ISKE 2 level. The reference years are 2018, 2020. So the report doesn't really look at the situation with COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that has changed the teaching profession or affected the teaching profession. Although we do make some considerations in the report. The data source for this analysis are the TALIS 2018, so the Teaching and Learning International Survey, which is many of you, I'm sure, will know very well, conducted by the OECD. And we complement this quantitative data on perceptions, behaviors of teachers with Eurydice data. And Eurydice data is basically policies, legislations, policy framework within the different education systems. The combination of the two data, so analyzing behaviors within a policy context, is maybe what is the most important added value of this report. So to see if actually policies influence the way teachers behave, or teachers perceive their profession, or teachers act as teachers, is one of the aspects which we think can mostly contribute to the development of policies themselves. As you can see, it covers a very big range of countries and education systems, and of course not for all of them TALIS data was available, but there where it was, we have used both sources of data for our analysis. So this just to give the general picture. I'll now go through some of the main findings, and of course this is only a glimpse given the time available, but I hope it will stimulate your discussions later on during the webinar. Can we move slide, please? So as Mr. Delbaere was saying, teacher shortages is not an issue that only Flanders is affected by. It's actually a problem that's a challenge for many education systems. Many of them declare that teacher shortages is on the agenda, is a problem. Recruiting teachers and ensuring that each classroom has sufficient teachers is a challenge that many countries share. You can see that sometimes this comes in combination with an aging teacher population and different other aspects of teacher shortages are the high dropouts from initial teacher education, or shortages of students enrolling in initial teacher education, or teacher dropouts, so teachers abandoning the profession, and sometimes even a combination of both. Teacher shortages, of course, is a shortcut to a complex problem, and which has different faces. There are countries which are affected by teacher shortages in some geographical areas, being urban or rural or isolated areas. Other countries are affected in specific subjects, notably usually STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, math. These are subjects that are particularly suffering from teacher shortages, although in other countries there might be others, like language teachers. And sometimes in some countries this actually affects the capacity of schools to deliver on their curriculum. So the good news, if we can say so, is that this is a problem that is affecting many countries, and therefore there is a lot of scope for exchange of information, for learning from each other at European level to find the right solutions. Many countries have reacted to this with a number of policies, mainly going in the direction of improving working conditions. And we'll look now at two or three specific aspects. If we can change slide, please. One aspect is surely the contractual status of teachers. We know that almost everywhere in Europe, the vast majority of teachers has the chance of accessing to an indefinite contract, not to a temporary contract. But still, there are probably high percentages of teachers that are still on a fixed term contracts. And when we analyzed how this breaks down across group ages, we see that at European level, over 1/3 of teachers below 35 years old are on a temporary contract. And then these figures drop as we move up in the age group. Now, of course, while this is understandable, as in many jobs you start with a temporary contract and then this is confirmed after some time, this actually works both ways. It works for the employer, but it also works for the teacher. And when you have pretty high concentrations of temporary contracts in specific age groups and in young teachers, then maybe there is a question to be answered. Is this really necessary, or can we move in another way? Can we do things differently? You see that in terms of Flanders, we are around 40% of teachers below 35 years old that are on declare to be, this is Thales data, so it's a declaration from it's the teachers themselves answering, are on a temporary contracts, around 40%. Of course, there are countries that are doing much worse with very high percentages in Spain, in Italy, Cyprus, Portugal, Austria. But still, in Flanders, the percentage, the share of teachers on fixed term contracts below 35 is higher than the EU average. And of course, a young teacher that is on a temporary contract might not feel secure enough to stay in the profession, or might feel actually to have the liberty to leave the profession and to take the decision to do so before things get serious, let's say. And can we change slide, please? Another aspect that we looked at is actually working hours. We know that teachers nowadays are involved in a number of tasks that go beyond teaching. Teaching is actually still the core of their work, but teaching comes with a number of other tasks and responsibilities that they have to perform. There are administrative tasks, there is relations with the parents or guardians, extracurricular activity, professional development, and so on and so forth. So when we analyze at European level how full-time teachers declare spending their time, this is the picture that we have, with less than 50% of their time devoted to teaching, and then let's say another quarter of their time goes into planning, preparation of lessons, and marking, correcting. So overall, around 75% goes into that, and another 25% goes in all the other tasks. When it comes to the data is not shown here. When it comes to data from Flanders, actually the situation is slightly better in terms of core tasks. So teachers actually on average manage to teach around 49% of their time, dedicate around 15% of their time to planning and preparation, and around 11% of their time to marking and correcting. Nevertheless, what we've also analyzed is as teachers work more and longer hours, how do these percentages shift? And so we divided the group of teachers in four quartiles. And what we see is that while teachers in the first quartile teach around 60% of their time, when it comes to the fourth quartile, so when they work longer hours, they actually, the share of teaching hours is less than 40%. So when teachers are given extra work, it is less in teaching in the core business and more in all the other type of activities. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, but the slide doesn't show. I think it's the way, doesn't show very well, but still, this is something that we've analyzed on teaching careers. The starting point is that there are two basic models in Europe, one which we call multi-level career model, and another one which is more single-level career model. So multi-level career model means that there are formal career steps in the teaching profession. So you start from, let's say, teacher junior, and then you move up to chief teacher, senior, or other names. So you actually move formally through steps of a career model, which entails a change in responsibility, in hierarchical relations, in salary, and so on and so forth. In many countries, though, this does not exist, and the teaching career is still a rather flat career, where you are teacher the day you start, and you are teacher the day you retire, without really a statutory change, although you would move along a salary scale and a salary increase. And of course, designing careers that are more dynamic, that give the sense of evolution to the new teachers that are engaging in the profession, can contribute to making the profession more attractive. Next slide, please. I'm aware of time, so I'm trying to go through the main findings, and these are only partial main findings, as quickly as possible. Another aspect that we have analyzed is initial teacher education, and specifically one aspect is early career support, which is normally given through an induction program. Now, this, I think there's been a very recent reform in Flanders about the early career support and induction program for teachers, which I believe was approved in 2019 or very recently. And what we actually see by analyzing the data is that, in fact, teachers in countries where there is legislation on induction, on this early career support, actually declare of participating in these programs, much more than in countries where it's either only recommended or not legislated at all. And now we know that the moment a young teacher starts the career, and that is valid maybe for all careers, the support, a framework that allows you to really put your hands on the job is really, really important. And in fact, when you look at statistics regarding the dropout rates of young teachers, it is in the first few years of their profession that they actually lose contact with the job. And therefore, having a system of supporting their career in the early steps, when a lot of learning, where this steep learning curve takes place, is absolutely fundamental. And we see that legislating in this area is very important to allow teachers to participate in such programs. Next slide, please. We've also looked at continuing professional development, and we've analyzed different aspects of continuing of professional development and how it is organized in the different countries. Overall, there is very high participation from TALIS data in continuing professional development, with over 93% of teachers declaring having participated in professional development over the 12 months before the survey. We've asked, from a legislation point of view, regulation policies, we've analyzed basically three aspects. If, or four maybe, the status of CPD, if it's a statutory duty, or if it's optional for teachers to decide to go on professional development or not. If this comes with the allocation of time as an entitlement, or actually as mandatory even, if there are provisions for paid study leave, and if schools are requested to draw up a plan, a continuing professional development plan. And what we see is that actually across Europe, countries have different models, but there where teachers, where legislation actually allocates time for teachers to participate in continuing professional development, either as an entitlement, so I have the right as a teacher to participate for so many hours or days in professional development, or even as mandatory, then there is more participation. So maybe something that legislation also can in legislation terms we can think of, that it is important to give teachers the time and to allocate time for continuing professional development, and making it a statutory duty without putting aside specific time is not enough. Next slide, please. In terms of, we've also looked at teacher appraisal, so the evaluation of teachers. Now, in Flanders, there is quite an organized system with the school principals that are in charge of doing a regular appraisal of teachers, which is meant actually mainly to provide feedback and improve the performance of teachers. In other countries, it might actually contribute to the promotion in a career where there are multi-level career steps, or to provide them with extra monetary bonuses and so on. In Flanders, we understand that the main goal is to provide teachers with some feedback and to improve to have this dialogue with the principal. And although the share of is quite high, there's still this issue of usefulness of feedback received by teachers from the main appraisal, which still is high, but not so high. So in the case of Flanders, less than 60% of teachers consider that the feedback they've received was useful. Next slide, please. On transnational mobility, I will just say that this is one aspect that we've looked at. There is an improvement of teachers participating in transnational mobility programs from 2013 to 2018. You can see it in the slide. And what we have also seen is that there where young teachers have participated during their initial teacher education program in a mobility program. So at that time, if they have gone on a mobility program, the likelihood of participating in mobility in this more European dimension during their career is much higher. Next slide, please. And I come to the last point, which is teachers' well-being, and specifically teachers' stress at work. Many teachers declare that they do experience stress at work. You can see that at European level, almost 50% of teachers declare that they are quite a bit or a lot, they experience quite a bit or a lot of stress at work. And for Flanders, the percentages are close to 70% altogether, of course. So I think this is quite a worrying issue, and something to be looked at very closely. We have analyzed to a certain extent some of the issues that impact this. In some, in the Thales questionnaire has looked at asking teachers from a list of reasons. Some of them are, for example, the administrative burden or the changing requirements at policy level for teachers. Also, the issue of accountability, of being considered accountable for students' performance is also a source of stress. And we've also looked at the fact that in some countries, what really, well, not some countries, at European level, basically what influences is actually student behavior, influences a lot the experience of stress, and the collaborative climate. So a collaborative climate within the school helps teachers to cope with the stress and actually lowers stress levels, or at least teachers declare less stress levels when they feel that they are working in a collaborative environment, and when they feel more self-confident in managing student behavior, in motivating students. So in two aspects which are really about relational aspects, and one really much linked to what Mr. Delbaere was saying, so to this expectation to make the difference in society, which is one of the main drivers for young people to become teachers. I know that has been a lot of information in very little time. I hope to have managed to contribute to this to your work for this webinar and in the coming months. You can follow us. I'm sure the presentation will be shared and distributed later on. So here you have the links to the different to the report and to the Eurydice network. Thank you very much. And I don't know if we have time. Maybe I've gone over time for questions, but I'll be happy to reply maybe later through email to questions.
Yeah, if the question, maybe I think it would be best if you indeed do it via mail, because I also know you have other meetings and presentations today. So also yes. Thank you for taking this time for us. It was very enlightening, I think, because it sets the Flemish problem in a perspective with other European countries. So I think it was very interesting. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Birch.
Thank you for inviting.
No problem. So we now turn to if we described the problem of teacher shortages on a European level, and now we will look at European solutions. And for that we turn to Mr. Tapio Savala. Tapio Savala has been working in the field of education since 1985. He started his career as a special needs education trainer and worked as a school headmaster and a senior advisor in the National Board of Education in Finland. He then joined the European Commission in 2002 to work for the lifelong learning policies and key competences in particular. Currently, he is head of unit education, audiovisual and culture executive agency responsible for adult learning, VET, e-twinning and e-pally platforms. And so he will be describing what Europe does in order to tackle these teacher shortages, especially in the context of the European education area and Erasmus+. We had some technical issues with Mr. Savala's camera, but he should be able to talk, so that's the most important one, and also to present. I don't know if it works, Mr. Savala?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I hope that you can see the slides now and you can hear my voice.
We don't see the slides yet, so maybe you have to start sharing them.
Can you then show the slides for me because.
So my colleague Leah is right now preparing to share the slides, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thank you.
So now you can see the slides and hear me. So I will start immediately.
Yeah.
I'm
great,
a bit conscious also of the time, so I try to be very brief. So the context for all the actions that we are doing is this European education area by 2025, which is described in the communication that was published in September last year. And as you can see, there are 6 different areas of work, and teachers are, of course, very important in all of these initiatives, but the education area specifically also raises the importance of teachers. And you can see in the next slide that we have some initiatives that I'm now going to explain to you very briefly, and some of them are targeting teachers as such, you know, the attractiveness of the profession, as we heard by the previous speakers. And then some are, let's say, more supporting teaching and schools in general with the competence frameworks, etc., etc. So the next slide, please. But the very idea is actually, that was already described before, is that teachers would be, the whole education area builds on teachers that are motivated, but they should also benefit from seamless continuum of high quality initial education, effective induction, and to the point professional development throughout their careers. And this includes participation in professional networks. That is also a very high motivation factor, and also benefit from learning mobility abroad. But indeed, these issues of attractiveness, shortages, and relevance of teacher education, initial and continuous, is an issue. So I will briefly explain what we are doing at the European level, and of course we will keep in mind that education is a national competence, and our role is to support policymakers, support practitioners through the Erasmus Plus program. So in the next slide, you will see one of the ideas that we are actually advocating quite a lot, which is to diversify teaching careers with the view of making them more attractive and more enriching during the careers that are long to teachers. And the idea here is that we are supporting member states who are willing to join this exercise to look at how to develop national career frameworks. Many countries already have competence frameworks, but here the idea would be to see how teachers could not only move towards leadership positions, which is moving upwards, but for instance, do different things during the careers, add different types of expertise in their portfolio of competencies, and even go out from the teaching profession to work in a company, for instance, and then come back. And there's actually quite a good basis for this work, because the working group on schools has done quite an interesting report, and I put the link in the slide that you can look at this further. But I think that this is something that may contribute to the attractiveness of the teaching professions if we can make them more, let's say, diversified, that it's not a long journey, long railway without stations or crossings, but that people can have the possibility of trying out different things. So let's move to the next slide, please. And this is, of course, by definition, clearly and directly related to the attractiveness and appreciation of teaching professions. As we know from Tallis, it was less than 1 in 5 in lower secondary level of teachers who felt that their profession is valued by society. So this is one of the ideas that we are creating a European Innovative Teaching Award. It will be available for the first round this year, so you will certainly hear about it a bit later. The learning mobility was mentioned as one of the priorities of the EU, and indeed We know the benefits, the European experience, competence development, but we also know the many obstacles like schedules, lack of recognition, and of course funding. So what we are doing also in the near future is to create a policy framework that would then help member states to look at how to enhance and increase the quality and quantity of teachers' mobility, be they student teachers or serving teachers. Next, please. This goes into the category of helping teachers to identify and develop their competencies throughout their careers. And there was already a selfie for schools that helped schools to, in a way, assess their digital maturity and then start planning ahead. Now we are preparing a tool which is a selfie for teachers themselves. And this is building on the digital competence frameworks, so that teachers will then be able to, let's say, assess their competencies in terms of digital education, but also plan ahead for further development. And that may also be collegial in a way that can be done together with other teachers. Next, please. So the Erasmus Teacher Academies, this is a new action in the Erasmus Plus program. And the idea here is actually to create networks and projects that bring together initial education and continuous education providers. And the idea is indeed to respect and enhance this career-long development and make those institutions that are providing either initial or continuous teacher education together with the relevant stakeholders and ministries, etc., who can have an impact on these issues. And they will work together on the common priorities like digital learning, sustainability, equity, and inclusion. But they also will offer teachers, student teachers, and serving teachers learning opportunities as well as mobility. And this is again something that due to the pandemic, we need probably to rethink also the ways we are, let's say, organizing mobility. So it might be that it will be a combination of virtual, physical, and blended mobilities in the future. And of course, we think that these networks would then be sustainable and create collaborative networks within each other, and then in that way also develop the provision of teacher education in Europe. Next slide, please. So for teacher education providers, we expect indeed that these teacher academies would give a kind of possibility to enhance their provision and enrich it, and also coordinate together mobilities and learning offer for teachers. And for the students and teachers, it would be very important that the offer that they get, the learning opportunities, are quality assured and recognized, because this recognition is one of the obstacles for mobility also. And since these are quite, let's say, new, innovative, and gathering together many stakeholders, we expect that they can also have a contribution to policy making on teacher education, also at the national and European levels. Next, please. So these were probably directly addressing teachers, but I will briefly mention other initiatives that are in the pipeline that are supporting schools and teachers to deal with, let's say, the common challenges like this environmental sustainability. So we are soon proposing a council recommendation on this environmental sustainability, and that also includes a competence framework so that teachers and students have a common understanding and common language on what does it mean in schools and in life in general if I'm respecting and contributing to sustainability. Next, please. The basic skills has been a priority of the EU policy work since 3 decades, if I remember correctly, and the same to address the disadvantaged learners. And we had a very successful recommendation on reducing and prevention of early school leaving. Now this idea comes back to basic skills and to how to make sure that everyone has a good pathway for finalizing schooling and finding a work. And this is again a kind of work that has started, and it will build on the monitoring systems, how to prevent failure in schools, how to intervene, and how to compensate. So these steps or these areas will be looked at in the same way as in the previous recommendation on prevention of early school leaving. Next one, please. And then it is not a surprise that learning from this pandemic and the emergency online teaching and learning that we are looking into this issue, and what we are now asked to do is to propose a council recommendation on online and distance learning, and how now also in the future make let's say the right blendings of online and on-site education in schools and online. So this is also something that we were in very close contact with member states during the pandemic, and we actually published already last year the kind of guidelines on blended learning in school education, and this was exactly to see what is the value of blending and how to do it, what are the factors that you need to take into account when you, let's say, combine online and on-site learning. This recommendation will be looking also to other areas of blending, like learning outside the school building, etc., etc. So it will take a little bit of broader approach to this blending, but it will be very interesting as it will be coming, and it will be coming actually towards the end of this year for the council to debate. Next one. And we should of course not forget the new Erasmus program for 2021 and 2027. It will be more inclusive, it will be greener, it will be more digital and participatory, and we have almost doubled the budget. And as you can see, there is one teacher who says that I love my job. And I guess that she loves the job because she can then join eTwinning as a learning community and as a nice reference group for teachers. And she can also learn from the School Education Gateway, which is full of interesting things for teachers and schools and policymakers to learn from. So the last slide is actually a bit of your homework, if I may. So I have collected here all the information that is behind of this brief overview, and I encourage you to look at it. There's also a link to the Teachers in Europe report that my colleague Peter just introduced to you. So I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I can stay later, you know, if there are any questions on these topics that I briefly explained. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Savala, for the very interesting presentation on all the different European initiatives that are coming up in the near future. We are running a little bit out of time, so I guess maybe it's best that we now turn to just the examples of how regions, local authorities, national authorities took some smart solutions in order to tackle these shortages. And we have 3 distinct and excellent speakers on the matter, which will give their perspective. And after that, if possible, we will have a Q&A. And the questions can be sent through the question box. If we don't have time enough for the Q&A, we can always try to address these questions through mail. But I will now move to Mr. Jan Tors. We will first stay in Flanders, actually, and we'll listen to Mr. Jan Tors and how the city of Antwerp tackles or tries to tackle the teacher shortage in a very specific and urban context. So, Mr. Tors, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maarten. Good day, everybody. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to give you some insight in how the city of Antwerp tries to tackle the challenge of the shortage of teachers. Now, of course, a lot of things are already addressed by our previous speakers, but I'll try to make it a bit more concrete by focusing on the situation in Antwerp. Now, for more than 10 years now, the city of Antwerp is being confronted with a shortage of teachers, like we've heard many other European cities as well. The shortage started in our primary education and has evolved the last years to be problematic as well for several subjects in secondary education. And based on monitoring the teacher staff, it becomes clear that this is a very complex problem created by multiple factors. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the factors that play an important role in Antwerp. Maarten, if you could show the next, thank you. First, there's a fast growing and more diverse population in the city, which creates, of course, a higher demand for schools and, of course, teachers as well. However, there's unfortunately a decrease of students in initial teacher training and also a decrease of graduates choosing to teach in Antwerp. So yes, we're really struggling to find teachers. Unfortunately, there's also a high dropout rate of young teachers leaving the occupation or choosing to teach in a more remote area instead of the urban city context of a diverse city center. Now, let's take a look at the numbers here. This graphic shows how many teachers remain in our organization after 1, 3, or 5 years. From the teachers who started teaching in 2012, so look at the red beam on the left side, in our city schools, only 55% remained 1 year later. This number decreased to 40% 3 years later, and 5 years later, only 38% were still working in our schools. Of course, there are multiple factors as why they leave our city schools, like complex regulation with permanent nomination, the priority rules, seniority, etc. But the fact remains that a vast number of them choose to switch to less complex areas. You notice that the last year, the numbers of remainers slightly rises. So I'd like to think that our efforts in initial teacher guidance are paying off, but maybe that's a bit too soon to make that conclusion. Anyway, in addition, the active teaching staff also shows a rather high rate of absenteeism. We get an average of about 6%. So as the school year progresses, it becomes more and more difficult to find substitutes. And due to a lack of sufficient teachers available in the labor markets, schools often are unable to fill the positions or have no other options but to hire someone without the required qualifications. In combination, as we heard, with a substantial amount of teachers going into retirement over the next few years and the growing number of pupils, the shortage of teachers will keep on growing. Finally, in secondary education, the problem is even more complex. Due to the fact that students in initial teacher education choose 2 subjects, there is a noticeable difference in supply and demand according to the subjects. For some subjects, there is an oversupply, and for others, there's a shortage, such as Dutch, French, mathematics, and more technical subjects like, for instance, electricity. So yes, to conclude, there is a real shortage. It's a complex problem, and it's not going to be easy to resolve. Now, let's take a closer look at our approach to tackle this problem. Maarten, if you could. Thank you. Since we've started monitoring 10 years ago, we've invested in several different actions to close the gap between supply and demand. We've tried to focus on as well attracting as retaining enough teachers with the right competencies needed in our city. To attract more students to the initial teacher training, our local education policy decided to run big media campaigns. Unfortunately, this didn't work, but we've noticed a positive side effect. Our active teaching staff felt acknowledged and appreciated, which is of course also important if we wish to lower the dropout rate of teachers as shown earlier. Currently, we focus primarily on communicating in a both positive and realistic way about the teacher profession by giving our teachers a voice in testimonies. Hereby you see some examples of testimonies we post on our website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and so on. We also established a talent house called Onderwijstalent in a unique operation with the Flemish Agency for Education Services and the Public Employment Service of Flanders. This talent house is specifically for anyone who wants to become a teacher or find a job as a teacher in Antwerp. Here we inform people from other branches about transfer options and provide job application tips through job fairs and info sessions. We even offer support to unemployed people by allowing them to take a professional exploratory internship and assist them with enrolling in the initial teacher training. Lately, we've been focusing on attracting and informing people active in other sectors, which are much needed for the shortage in certain subjects in secondary education. We also organize walks to our city center with visits to some of our most diverse populated schools to change the mindset of unknown and unloved and to create a positive spin. A more recent collaboration with our local partner focuses on attracting more diversity, as our current teaching staff are mostly white middle-class women, especially in primary education. We believe it's important to have a teaching staff with a broader representation of a diverse group of pupils and that there's a lot of undiscovered potential among that group. But diversity is, of course, a broad concept. So to try and make a difference, we've chosen ethnical diversity as our first focus. On this slide, you see that in our public school, 76% of the teachers are female. And on the right side, you notice that 84% of our teachers come from a Belgian origin. Well, if you know that 50% of the population in Antwerp has a different background, coming from more than over 180 different countries, we can say that there's still a lot of room for improvement in that area. Anyway, in cooperation with both education and youth organization, as well as the initial teacher education in Antwerp, we are developing a service to discover and encourage these young potentials into becoming teachers. In the meantime, we also focus on HR policies in schools to map out possible thresholds or opportunities to recruit and retain these teachers. So these are some of our main actions we set up in order to attract new teachers. Most of these actions, of course, are not quick wins, but will hopefully pay off in a longer perspective. Then now let's take a look at some of the actions we take to retain our teachers, sorry. In our city schools, as well as in any other school, I think, of course, a lot of effort goes into the initial teacher guidance at school level. But I presume that this is a kind of standard operation in all European countries these days. On a city level, however, we invest a lot of effort in local collaborations. These collaborations with local partners often originate from different networks that we facilitate, where all the Antwerp school boards, initial teacher education, and other Flemish education partners are represented. Together, we've chosen to focus on 3 themes, which is leadership, the perception of the teacher profession, and the core of the profession, all, of course, with the common goal to reduce the teacher shortage. Of course, it takes time to build trust and to cooperate in a sufficient transparency. For a long time, for instance, it seemed that the topic of leadership was a topic we couldn't tackle on a city level due to each school board's autonomy. But as a result of our collaborations and networks, we've combined our forces into a joint project application with a clear view on the needs and gaps from the education field. Specifically, to retain our teacher, we've created also a network for initial teacher guidance, to learn with and from each other, and to strengthen all teachers in the first 3 years. In this network, there's a representation from the initial teacher education and mentors from the school boards to close the gap and to increase the professional continuous development. On a more international level, our local education policy participates in networks like the ET 2020 Working Group. As we've seen, it's the European Network on Education and Training. Now, in this working group, we've contributed to the discussion on a teacher's career. As a result, there's a more clear view on the different career pathways as a teacher, which is often seen as flat and with little opportunities. There was also a peer learning activity hosted by the City of Antwerp on leadership, and we've also initiated partnerships with other European cities on how to prepare students better in the initial teacher education for the diversity in our city and how they can see it as a benefit and a strength. So ultimately, they want to stay and teach in our city. To encourage students to pursue a teaching career in Antwerp, we are currently investigating the possibility of making them familiar with the urban school context and a teaching possibility the city has to offer through an interactive urban game app. So anyway, our purpose, of course, in each endeavor is to find enough competent and diverse teachers in Antwerp to benefit all of the children in our city into reaching qualification. So this was, in a nutshell, some of the actions I wanted to share with you and how we tried to find solutions in Antwerp to this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. It was very, very interesting, especially to see how you indeed also try to retain all the different teachers. So that's a very interesting perspective. So now we turn to Mr. Connor McCord. Mr. McCord works for the Irish Department of Education, which has also set up a specific track in tackling teacher shortages, in which OVSG was actually very interested because the results looked very promising. So Mr. McCord, the floor is entirely yours.
Thank you very much, Maarten, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about some of the things we've done in Ireland in response to the challenge of teacher supply. And I'm just going to start with a very brief overview of the Irish school system. We have 3,100 approximately primary schools and 730 second level schools. The schools in Ireland, unlike some other countries, are generally independent entities. They're run by their own boards of management. The teachers are direct employees of the schools in most cases. At primary level, some of our schools are very small. We have well over 700 schools with less than 60 pupils, so 3 or 4 teachers in the school, and that brings its own challenges as well. At the moment, about 550,000 primary level school students, and those figures are decreasing over the next few years. And we've about 380,000 second level students. Those enrollment figures are going to increase up to about 2024 and then decrease thereafter. Could I have the next slide, please? When it comes to teachers, we have about 39,000 full-time equivalent primary level teaching posts. We have 33,000 approximately second level teaching posts. We have 109,000 teachers registered with the Teaching Council, which seems quite a lot when you look at the number of posts, but a lot of those teachers are registered in different sectors other than primary and secondary. And we have 14 higher education institutions providing initial teacher education. There are, of those, some of them are quite specialist and small, a number are large. Just three of them, though, do both primary and post-primary education. And I think just to note that the teaching profession in Ireland, it hasn't historically been difficult to attract people into initial teacher education programs. They're generally highly sought after and almost always oversubscribed, in fact. So, could I have the next slide, please? So in the last few years, maybe going back 3 or 4 years, we started getting reports from the schools of difficulties in recruiting teachers. And the problems seem to be different in the different sectors. So at primary level, the real problems seem to be in recruiting teachers for substitute positions. So these are teachers needed to fill short-term vacancies as opposed to permanent positions. And similar to earlier speakers, at post-primary, schools were reporting that it was teachers of particular subjects such as STEM, modern foreign languages, and Irish, the subject of Irish here. And there also seemed to be a regional element of the difficulties, particularly in Dublin. Dublin, probably down to the cost of living in Dublin. It was probably the issue there. So Dublin is a problem. The west of Ireland wouldn't have quite the same pressures at all. It's difficult to know why these pressures have been arising. I did say the enrollments were falling away, but in fact they grew significantly through the 2000s. That was definitely pressure. As I said, we have regional elements leading to problems. We also have a lot of our teachers work abroad. A lot of the Irish graduates are particularly in English-speaking countries in the United Kingdom, Australia, for example. And also we have a large number of Irish teachers working in the Middle East, particularly in the United Arab Emirates. So that's another factor we need to consider. Could I have the next slide, please? So these, the problems led us to develop in the Department of Education a teacher supply action plan. We launched that in November 2018. It has 22 actions across 4 policy areas. So we decided that the problem should be tackled in 4 streams, as it were. So our first policy area is data and research to support teacher supply planning. Second policy area, higher education. The third one is a long name, policies and arrangements impacting on teacher supply. And then we also have a communication strand and a strand to promote the teaching profession. I'll talk to each of these points a bit more in a short while. Could I have the next slide, please? So we then, I hope you can follow this slide, but we set up a structure within the Department of Education We set up 6 working groups to look at teacher supply. If you can follow this, at the top of this diagram, we've got the teacher supply steering group. That is overall oversight of the program of actions and approves the action plan and the actions being taken. It's a very senior group made up of senior members from the Department of Education, chief executives of various state agencies, senior people from the universities and colleges, from school management bodies. It's chaired by the Secretary General of the Department of Education. So the senior civil servant with responsibility for education chairs that group. Then feeding into that, we have an implementation group. That's more or less an internal group from the department of senior officials looking at the relevant policy areas. And then we have 4 working groups: the data working group, communications working group, higher ed working group, and policies arrangements working group. And you might remember that matches back to the 4 policy areas. So there's a working group looking at each policy area. And the working groups are made up of department officials, but also many representatives from stakeholders in education. So from the higher education institutions, from the teaching council, from school management bodies, and so on and so forth. Go to the next slide, please. So just to talk to some of the particular actions, what we've actually done. The first area is data and research to support teacher supply planning. And I suppose the main thing, the biggest thing we've done in that area was the production of a technical report called Teacher Demand and Supply in Ireland 2020 to 2036. Published that, as I said, in November 19. Historically, the Department of Education, we've historically had very little data that would inform our decisions around teacher supply. We were relying on anecdotal information, sometimes some surveys from school management bodies, but there was definitely a gap in our knowledge. So the technical report was our first attempt at addressing this gap. So it analyzes projected student enrollments, teacher supply figures, retirements of teachers, resignations, dropouts, and so on and so forth, and projects the demand and supply of teachers out to 2036. And in fact, our projections would suggest that we have an oversupply of teachers and will continue to have out to 2036. We currently have an undersupply of second level teachers to 2022, which is only a year away, obviously. Thereafter, an oversupply. But the problem at post-primary, again, as the previous speakers have referred to, is the problem is subject teachers. But we may have enough teachers, but we don't have them in the right subjects. So again, STEM, modern languages, and Irish are problematic. Our next step under data analysis is to try to analyze subject teacher demand and supply at second level and produce a further report on that. And our ultimate aim would be to develop a working model of teacher demand and supply that would support teacher supply planning into the future. Could I have the next slide, please? So in the higher education area, just going to talk about 2 actions we took, specific ones. Again, looking at the subject areas of shortage, STEM, modern foreign languages, and Irish. The HEIs responded to our call and developed new undergraduate second level initial teacher education programs, both in 2019 and 2020 in those particular subjects. And another development that's just kicked off in January of this year, we've put in place 3 upskilling programs for second level teachers. So we're taking already qualified, already registered teachers and upskilling them over a 2-year period to be teachers also of Spanish, mathematics, and physics. These are also subjects of shortage. And we're hoping to put a new upskilling program in place for Irish in 2022. These are part-time, flexible delivery models, no cost to the participating teacher, and we're very heavily oversubscribed to the extent, in fact, we're going to increase the numbers of those programs in 2022 as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, under the policies and arrangements impacting teacher supply, these were just some of the practical things we could do ourselves to increase, in particular, to increase the supply of teachers. So we put in place a substitute teacher supply panel as a pilot project. A supply panel is where the teacher is employed by a central school and he or she is used to fill short-term vacancies in neighbouring schools. It's usually in a cluster of maybe 15 to 20 schools. We piloted that just in 6 locations across the country in 2019-20, and it was extremely successful. We also introduced a teacher sharing scheme, a formal scheme whereby 2 second level schools can share the same teacher. It's very unusual sort of arrangement in the Irish context where we're talking about two separate employers, two separate entities in normal circumstances. That idea really didn't take hold. Not many schools have taken this scheme up, but we're hoping that we might push it further in the next short while. We also made some changes to terms and conditions for teachers who are on career break or job sharing. Previously, there were restrictions on the number of days they could cover, the number of days they could work to fill short-term vacancies. So we removed those restrictions to increase the supply of teachers, particularly for substitutable posts. Could I have the next slide, please? Under the communication strand, we've been running a campaign called Teaching Transforms for the last 3 years or so. It promotes the teaching profession. That's key really to maintain the students who are interested in coming into the profession, into the initial teacher education programs. So we targeted specifically at school students, at third level students, and in fact their parents as well. We use social media, radio advertising, newspapers, we attend careers fairs and so on and so forth. And it's all supported by a new website that we developed called Teaching Transforms, which has on it information how to become a teacher in Ireland, including teachers from outside Ireland who might be interested in working here, as conditions of employment and terms and conditions and things like that. The latest phase of our campaign included the promotion of diversity in the teaching profession. So we had a recent campaign over Christmas and the New Year. So we featured members of minority ethnic communities and the LGBT+ community and so on. And if I could have the next slide, please. This is just a banner ad from our last campaign. Young student teacher here, Keelan Simon, he's a member of the Muslim community. He was also involved in video clips and radio ads that we used. And the idea is this links then, this appears on your smartphone, you click the link and you're brought to the Teaching Transforms webpage. Could I have the next slide, please? Also in the communications area, we have ongoing consultations with the stakeholders. This is by stakeholders, again, I mean the school management bodies, the universities, the teaching council, the higher education authority, also with parents and students, including primary school students. So we've been doing that throughout for the last 3 years, and the teacher unions, of course, as well. We produce a periodic teacher supply newsletter to keep people up to date on the developments and plans, and that includes the general public. We've also developed a substitute teacher recruitment portal. This is an online resource for schools to match vacancies with available teachers. We have about 6,000 teachers registered with that to cover substitute short-term teacher vacancies. That was developed by one of our partners, not by the Department of Education, but developed by the Irish Primary Principals Network. So a good example, I think, of cooperation between stakeholders for a common goal. And as is the next one, which was a recruitment website developed by the post-primary school management bodies to match Irish teachers, Irish registered teachers living outside Ireland with vacancies in Ireland. It's called tourasawalia.com, which is an Irish word. Next slide, please. Just before I finish, I thought I should mention some specific actions that we've taken in response to COVID-19, which has obviously created a lot more challenges than we would have anticipated 1.5 years ago. We've been continuously targeting teachers with key messages, and we've been using the Teaching Council of Ireland to do this. So the Teaching Council has a direct communications route to the 109,000 registered teachers. And so, for example, a simple thing, but recently we contacted all registered teachers requesting that they'd make themselves available for short-term vacancies and asking them to register with the online portal Subseeker. And in fact, many thousands, quite a few thousand teachers did that following that call. I mentioned earlier that we ran primary teacher supply panels as a pilot in 2019. So again, this is where a teacher in a central school covers a vacancy in a cluster of schools around that central school. So we expanded that nationwide. So we went from 6 panels, 6 locations in 2019-20 to 105 across the country. So well over 2,000 schools now have access to a substitute teacher through the supply panel. And we have about 330 teachers employed full-time on those panels covering short-term vacancies. And we've also, it's not the first resort for schools, but rather than employing a non-teacher, schools are moving now to recruiting student teachers to fill short-term positions as well. And particularly now as the year is coming to an end, the academic year, there are a lot more student teachers available. Typically, these will be final year student teachers. We have about 3,500 of those at the moment. Could I have the next slide, please? So we're certainly, we've quite a bit done, but a lot more to do. Just outline our next steps. We'll be publishing shortly an updated teacher demand and supply report with more projections, this time out to 2038, publishing a revised action plan. We're due to also launch another new portal to recruit teachers, to match teachers with long-term teaching vacancies as opposed to short-term substitutable vacancies. Ultimately, what we want to do is develop a model of demand and supply that we can use for teacher supply planning into the future. If I could have the next slide, please. I just thought I should mention maybe what are some key components of what we've done so far. And I think the first one I have here is shared ownership of the challenges and solutions across all stakeholders. So we've been conscious that and try to remind people that the responsibility here, we have central responsibility as a department for leading on this, but the solutions are not just for us, they're for all stakeholders. And I've mentioned a few of them already. Also, what we've done is a leadership and commitment at a very senior level nationally. So the Secretary General of the department, the head of the Department of Education, he personally chairs 2 of the working groups. And in the early meetings of the working groups, the Minister for Education himself at the time, he attended the meetings as well. We've had a coherent plan, I hope, and also we've continuously had stakeholder communication and consultations to keep everyone on board and keep them informed of what we're doing. Could I have the next slide, please? And that's really it, I think. I hope you follow that brief overview of what we're doing. I've just put in some links here to some of the documents that I mentioned in my talk, and there's also my email address, and I'm happy to deal directly with any queries you might have if we don't get a chance here today to talk to them. Thanks very much, Maarten. No,
thank you very much, Mr. Boucourt. It was very interesting and very comprehensive also. So I think that's also very concrete, and yeah, I think it was a very, very interesting presentation. And so last but not least, we now listen to Mr. Bodil Bevner from the Swedish Association for Local Authorities and Regions. This perspective is also particularly interesting, seeing that the organization of Mr. Bevner is also primarily focused on local authorities, regions, cities, and municipalities. So, Mrs. Bevner, the floor is entirely yours. There you go.
Thank you very much. First, let me start by saying that this has been very interesting to listen to the others, and we see quite a few similarities with Sweden, but also some differences maybe. As you mentioned, I come from the Swedish Association for Local Authorities and Regions, so we're not the government, but we're an organization for the local governments. So we are the ones who close deals with unions at national level, and we also support our members, the municipalities, to develop strategies. Because as we do have a teacher shortages in Sweden, it looks a bit different from different parts in Sweden. And I will tell you a little about our approach to this issue. And the first is, of course, that we need to train more people, but it's not as simple as that. If you could put on the next slide, please. Because what we see is we need to train more teachers, but on the other hand, we need to train more to other occupations as well. So this illustrates that all the people in the top, there are about 100,000. If you have over a 10-year period, you would say that is a cohort is about 100,000 people in Sweden. And when those graduate from secondary, you have quite a lot of them going to working life, and the red ones on the top, they are the ones going to higher education. So a little less than half of a population of a cohort is going to higher education. And then in higher education, although teacher education and training is a very large part, it's about 25% of those who are in higher education that go to teacher training. But we do need a lot of other occupations as well, and we do need higher education, which is not for a specific application, but for all the knowledge that we need to have in the society. And then if you look further, you can see how many of those starting teacher training who also becomes teacher. And in the end, at the bottom right, you see that about 8,000 people in average every year becomes a teacher out of 100,000 in Sweden. We do see an increase in this number over the past years, and we do see also an increase in the people who apply for teacher training. But if we look at all the number of kids and also adult education and preschool education, etc., we would need to be about 15,000 instead of 8,000. So it's really is a large gap if we look into a bit further down the line, because as many people we do have many who retire. So what we see is, although we have a higher interest for becoming a teacher, it will not be sufficient. So we need to do other things as well. And then you can put up the next slide, please. So we look at different parts. We look at it, how to train teachers, and we note how this would be, there need to be more flexible paths to become a teacher. But even though we do a lot of different ways that support people to become teachers, there is still this, as the previous picture showed, that there are not all the many people that we would need. So we also need to keep people in the education profession, as some of the other speakers has mentioned as well. But it's, of course, you should not be stuck in the teaching profession, but we would like also it would be easy to do something else and then come back to the teaching profession. And we do also need that when you retire, we have a lot of municipalities who but teacher who has retired come back to work, maybe with specific issues or maybe with special support in school or something like that, but they can come back and work. But even if we have all these trained to be teachers, and we see in Sweden that we do not have very many teachers who go to other professions. Of course, some do, but it's not a very high number, and it's not so it's not there we can really become more teachers. But we need to do that as well. So we need to work both on training and retain teachers in the teaching profession. But it will still not be sufficient. So if you turn to the next slide, please. We also need to work a lot on, so if we cannot have the many teachers that we would need if we continue to work as we have done before, so how could we organize school in such a way that the teachers, the numbers will be sufficient? We need to organize in different ways. I heard that the one from Ireland, when you say that two schools can cooperate with the same teacher. You can also think that maybe there are some things that could be supportive in the classroom by others than teachers, and we could have teams, which would mean that teacher could plan lessons and could do some of the lessons, but maybe then be supported in other tasks. So there would be more time for the tuition. We need to think of how to use digitalization, how to use ICT. And there, I mean, COVID is of course a very bad thing, but we have seen some new ways to support, not only to have distance education, but rather also to see when it would be useful and how it would be useful. And like you could think that maybe you could have a teacher who give a presentation on a film, and there is someone else than a teacher supporting the most of the pupils in the class. And then the teacher could be in another room and telling the same thing, but for those pupils who really need specific explanation. So we need to think of how to organize things in a way that the teachers we have could also get through to more pupils, so to say. So the main message to work on all these issues at the same time, and we tried from our organization to be cooperative between all the different municipalities, so they can learn from each other, especially those who share the same features, because we have some with very small schools and large areas, and then we have others where they have a very pupils that come from very many different countries, and we don't share the same language, etc. So we try to be supportive so that the same kinds of school could share examples with themselves and learn by organization. So because we are running a bit late, maybe I could stop there and see if we have some time for questions.
Actually, thank you, of course, first for again your very interesting presentation. I took a look at the question that were sent in advance, and actually most of them were answered in the presentations. And then also, in order for not to run too much out of time, I think maybe we can go to the ending, the closing statement of Mr. Leroy. I would also again like to thank all the speakers and the practical examples. I think it was very interesting and enlightening. So thank you, Mrs. Beafner. So now we go to the closing statement. As a closing statement, I'm very happy to present to you Mr. Fons Leroy. Mr. Leroy was the managing director of the Flemish Employment and Vocational Training Service between 2005 and 2019. He has a law degree and a degree in criminology with a special diploma in public administration and government management. After his studies, Fons Leroy spent some time in Canada, where he made a study of the legal aid system. He taught at University of Applied Science in Brussels and was responsible for the study department of the State Employment Service. In 1990, he became deputy head of cabinet for the then community minister for employment. And for 15 years, he worked as a deputy head of cabinet and later as head of cabinet of the Flemish Ministries of Employment. There he helped design the Flemish employment policy, and in 2005 he then became the head of the Flemish Service for Employment and Vocational Training. As of July 2019, he was retired, and now Mr. Leroy still gives lectures on HR management and labor market policy, and in that context he will make the link between a good HR policy for teachers and the linkages, of course, with the labor market. So Mr. Leroy, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your introduction, Maarten. Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank VLEVA and OVSG for the organization of this seminar on this important topic of teacher shortages. This topic is an important issue in many European countries, as mentioned in the Eurydice report. And it's not only important in the context of today, but also in the near future. And we should be aware that our national and European labor markets are confronted with huge challenges in the next decade. Challenges such as robotization, digitalization, migration, the climate change, new health risks, but also the graying population, which will provoke a permanent pressure on our labor markets and pressure in all sectors and in all professions, but especially for those sectors and professions with growth perspectives, such as the sector of education, vocational training, and lifelong learning. And from a labor market perspective, the shortage of teachers is more important than other bottleneck vacancies, such as welders, operators, construction workers, engineers, and even doctors and nurses. Because the shortage of teachers has a multiplier effect on the labor market. If due to not having enough teachers, we risk that the quality of the education outcomes becomes less, will have more youngsters to enter the labor market with less knowledge, less competences, and will have a greater gap between offer and demand. And this in an economic situation where we need people with more competences and a higher degree of education than ever before. And that's why we urgently need to set up new and combined strategies to tackle this shortage. I will give you some possible strategies to deal with this issue. First of all, we should invest in the attractiveness of the job of a teacher. And this is not only a question of remuneration and labor conditions, but also and foremost a question of how to organize attractive and sustainable careers for teachers. How to switch from flat career structures towards multi-level career structures. And I think that the Finnish concept of the house of workability, I prefer to call it the house of work happiness, is an inspiring practice to assure that there is a permanent fit between the teacher and the school and the education system. Because the house of work happiness, the house of workability, pays attention next to remuneration and working conditions to career and learning opportunities, mental and physical health issues, job crafting and job carving, attitudes and values, ergonomic adjustments, team working, self-regulation, and workability. And another interesting example, besides the one presented today in the context of workability, is, for example, the workload reduction toolkit, which is used in the UK, or the inclusion of teachers' assistants in the Netherlands to assure that teachers are spending their main time in teaching and not in administration. A second way is to increase the influx of teachers, not only aiming at students and unemployed persons to become teachers, but also by encouraging transition from other sectors, from, for instance, persons working in shrinking sectors and shrinking professions and shrinking companies towards the sector of education, or encouraging transition supporting older employees towards the profession of a teacher by introducing shorter ways to become a teacher based on alternative work-based pathways and the validation of acquired competences and experiences. Working on the influx needs also a stronger focus on increasing the diversity in the population of teachers, as shown in the Antwerp case and the IRIS action plan today. We still see that persons from ethnic minorities, for example, are less represented in this population. Therefore, we need to invest in more inclusive recruitment, training, and HR policies to attract more people with a migrant origin. A third way, and this goes especially for countries such as Belgium, France, and others, is to install dual learning as a regular form of education. In dual learning, there's a shared responsibility on the learning outcomes between schools and companies. A great part of the time spent by teachers in a full-time form of education is in dual learning, replaced by training, learning, and coaching on the work floor, supported and guaranteed by the coaches appointed by the companies. And finally, a fourth way is that we should also use new technologies to bridge the gap between offer and demand concerning teachers and teaching time. We are globally moving towards a more digital society to a more robotized economy. So why not use the digital and technological means to improve and reorganize our education pathways? I'm not only referring to distance learning and more blended forms of education, but also to the use of deep machine learning, AI technologies, and so on. I'm convinced that the smart use of these technologies can reduce the human efforts, human teaching efforts, as also illustrated in the Swedish presentation. We already see in the sector of vocational training today that the use of these technological means has an impact on the population of trainers without a decline of the performance results. So that's also to consider in the future, how can we use technology to bridge the gap between offer and demand in the teaching professions. Let me finish by saying that I'm convinced that we should examine on a short time these and other solutions to reduce teacher shortages, now and in the near future, because the future of our welfare states and the future of Europe is based on well-educated and well-skilled people. That's why this topic should have the highest priority in labor market and education policies. I thank you for your attention and for your participation in this seminar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leroy, for the reflection. I also think it should be a priority to tackle the teacher shortages. Thank you again for your reflection. And I think it was the perfect end to a very interesting webinar today. But before we end, I would like to give a sincere thank you to our top speakers and experienced experts on the duty today, Mr. Delbaere, Mr. Zavala, Mr. Birch, Mr. McCourt, Mr. Tors, Mrs. Babner, and Mr. Leroy. My co-organizer Anne Berkmoes from OVSG for the wonderful brainstorms and cooperation, and my colleague Lea for the necessary support during the webinar, and of course also our attentive and very interesting audience today. Also, the recording of the webinar and the presentations will be forwarded to you in the follow-up mail, and we hope to welcome you at many other VLEVA events in the meantime and in the future. Thank you again, and keep it safe and keep it healthy. Bye bye.